All right, let's keep going here with another edition of Mr. Clendenning's History Readings. We are on chapter 28 for section 3. So if you're following along, we're going down to section 3 here. We read before about the space race and how Cuba becomes a communist country, about the Berlin Wall going up in 1961, Cuban Missile Crisis, almost World War III in 1962. And now we're at struggles at home for this lesson. So that's the title. So we might be thinking about what's happening at home where we have to problems we kind of solve. And you might see from some of those key words that African Americans, and there was black people, and segregation was a major issue of the time. And in many ways it still is. Okay. First word is fulfill, to carry out or put into effect. Next word is riot, a violent public disturbance. Question is, how did groups attack segregation? Another vocab, tactic, a method of doing something. Desegregation, acts to remove segregation in public places. Another question, how did violence against protesters increase? Here's a picture of sit-ins. So 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 college students staged a sit-in to protest their treatment at an all-white restaurant. So what they did is they just sat in the restaurant and they wouldn't be served, but they would also not, they would be taking up space for other customers, and they did that on purpose. Citizens seeking change, peaceful protests and riots. So looking at that. What was the March on Washington? How was President Kennedy assassinated? See there. Motorcade, that's a parade of cars. Developing country, a nation that is slowly improving its industry and economy. What did Kennedy achieve as president? And look at the Peace Corps. All right, giddy up. In the 1960s, the struggle for African American equality moved from the courts to the streets. Segregation was still the law of the land in many parts of the country. Many African Americans were denied the right to vote. Some progress had been made during the 1950s. Yet African Americans were still treated as second-class citizens in many parts of the country. In June 1963, President Kennedy said, "The time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise for equality. Those who do nothing are inviting shame as well as violence." The federal government tried to help end inequality and segregation for African Americans. Excuse me. How did groups attack segregation? A group of African Americans and whites called Freedom Riders boarded buses and headed south. Their plan was to draw attention to segregation in the southern states. The group was led by James Farmer of the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. Following the example set by Martin Luther King Jr., the Freedom Riders believed in peaceful protests. Yet some of their buses were burned. Many people were beaten. Television cameras brought the same shame of segregation into the living rooms of the American people. During 1962 and 1963, the civil rights movement caught the attention of the nation. Riots broke out at the University of Mississippi. A riot is a violent public disturbance. James Meredith was not allowed to attend because he was African American. A court ordered the university to admit him. The governor of the state said that he would keep Meredith out. Meredith's life was threatened. Mobs of white people protested his admission. Local police failed to keep the peace. President Kennedy sent federal troops to the university to protect Meredith. Meredith became the first African American to attend the University of Mississippi. How did violence against protesters increase? Segregation in public places was still practiced in many parts of the South. African American protesters focused their efforts on this injustice. So, something that's wrong, that's an injustice. They organized boycotts, remember that's when you refused to buy, protests, and sit-ins. These tactics upset many white Southerners and resulted in violence against the peaceful protesters. It became clear that the federal government had to act. A national civil rights bill was sent to Congress by President Kennedy. It was known as the Civil Rights Act. Approved in 1964, the bill granted the federal government authority to speed up school desegregation. It protected the voting rights of African Americans. The law also required an end to segregation of public places. Civics Connection. Citizens seeking change, peaceful protests, and riots. Americans have a long tradition of protests. Colonists used boycotts to protest their unfair treatment by England. In the Boston Tea Party, colonists ruined tons of tea, although no lives were lost. In the mid 1900s, a civil rights movement worked to stop racist practices. Most leaders looked for peaceful ways to protest. However, protests often resulted in fights between protesters and racists. This violence helped Americans see the ugliness of racism. More and more people began to support the African Americans' cause. They pressured Congress to change the laws. The president then enforced the new laws. The violence that tried to stop the movement helped advance the cause of civil rights. At times, riots broke out. The 1965 rioting in Watts neighborhood in Los Angeles is one example. The riots led to much damage and looting, mostly in African American communities. The riots hurt them economically. However, rioting also called attention to the anger felt by African Americans. Both protests and riots played a role in helping people see that the time for change had come. Why do you think African American sit-ins and marches often resulted in violence by whites? Do you think the protesters expected this? Why or why not? So, if you think about black people sitting in a restaurant that they're not welcome in, they'd be yelled at, be made fun of, maybe their chairs kicked, maybe they're pushed over. And after all that intimidation, the black or the African Americans will not leave because they are brave and they're trying to prove a point. Why did it result in violence? Because the violence was maybe the only way that the whites felt like they could still maintain control. They wanted to use basically terror or fear to get them out. Which is a more effective way to get social change, peaceful protest or violent protest? Well, if you're using violence to protest, people are going to probably dismiss it and say, well, they're bad because they're hurting people. If you're using a peaceful protest, people might say, they're willing to be out there in the rain and the snow, and they're willing to endure all of that. And here they are, good people, still trying to obtain a good cause. That's how I would answer that question. What was the March on Washington? On August 28, 1963, more than 200,000 people gathered peacefully at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. The March on Washington was organized by African American leaders to show support for the passage of the Civil Rights Bill. Participants in the march included African Americans and whites of all ages. Many waved small American flags. There were songs, prayers, and speeches. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to the marchers of his dream for America. His speech was a challenge to the nation. It was also a message of hope. How was President Kennedy assassinated? President Kennedy began to turn his thoughts toward being re-elected. He flew to Texas to begin his campaign. On Friday, November 22nd, 1963, so that I remember that as 11/22/63. Okay, it's kind of like 1, 2, 3 almost. President Kennedy rode through the streets of Dallas, Texas. Riding with him were his wife and Governor John Connally of Texas and Connally's wife. The motorcade was moving through the streets of downtown Dallas when shots were fired. Governor Connally was seriously wounded. President Kennedy, who had been shot in the head and neck, was dead. A few hours later, Vice President Johnson took the presidential oath of office. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested and accused of killing the president. 2 days later on live television, Jack Ruby shot and killed Oswald. The nation was shocked that Kennedy had been assassinated. What had Kennedy achieved as president? During President Kennedy's brief time in office, he did many things that had lasting effects. In 1961, the Peace Corps was established to work in developing countries. A developing country is a nation that is slowly improving its industry and economy. The first Peace Corps volunteers were sent as teachers to the African nation of Ghana. 5 years later, more than 10,000 Americans were serving in 52 countries. When communists threatened Southeast Asia, Kennedy allowed the transport of troops and equipment to aid them. Under Kennedy, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty. The treaty made above ground nuclear tests illegal. One of his strongest moves was allocating, so in other words, sending $20 billion to NASA with a challenge to put America on the moon by 1970, which we would in 1969. Okay? The picture is the first Peace Corps volunteers that provide help to nations in Africa. What do you think? Why do you think it is important to protest peacefully? So we talked about a little bit that before. If you are supporting a great cause, you'd be willing to sit out there in whatever kind of weather and endure any kind of hardships. If you are for violence and you want to hurt people, people usually do not respect that. And so if you're using violence, it usually does not get you thrown in jail for starters. And so your protests are not going to last very long. But, okay. So those are the questions, and that's it for